Hello, and welcome to the Scope of Things podcast, a no-nonsense look at the promise and problems of clinical research based on a sweep of the latest news and emerging trends in the field, and what I think is worthy of your 30 or so minutes of time. I'm Deborah Borfit, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News, which means I spend a lot of time with my ear to the ground on your behalf, and a lot of hours every week speaking to top experts from around the world. Please consider making this your trusted go-to channel for staying current on things that matter, whether they give us hope or cause for pause. In another 8 minutes or so, I'll be speaking with Jonathan Kimmelman, PhD, Professor of Biomedical Ethics at McGill University, about current dilemmas in clinical development and how research standards are trending. But first, the latest news, including the fallacy of a survival benefit for cancer patients participating in clinical trials, launch of a network integrating clinical research with community-based primary care, how those houses are currently divided, how and why federally qualified health centers are getting involved in studies, efforts to disrupt the current practice of excluding pregnant and lactating women from participation, how flicker stimulation is being explored as a therapy for epilepsy, and staggeringly good news about the impact of precision medicine on the outcomes of kids suffering from aggressive cancers. It has long been held that cancer patients have better outcomes when they participate in clinical trials, but no one put that notion to the test until now. After looking at the supposed participation effect, researchers found that evidence for it is lacking. It turns out that the survival benefit disappears in studies designed to address important sources of confounding, such as the fact that trials tend to enroll younger and healthier patients, and bias, notably that many studies of participation benefit are probably never published. The take-home message here is that the inability to enroll in a cancer trial doesn't disadvantage a patient, at least in terms of survival, and that patients and physicians might want to focus their consent discussions on the most relevant and evidence-based benefits of trial participation, that is, the prospects of advancing the care of future patients. You can find a link to the published analysis in the show notes. The National Institutes of Health is launching a $30 million pilot to test the feasibility of a national primary care research network that integrates clinical research with community-based primary care to create a learning health system. The initiative, called Communities Advancing Research Equity for Health, or Care for Health for short, aims to improve access to clinical research to inform medical care, focusing on communities historically underrepresented in studies or underserved in healthcare. It will initially leverage existing NIH-funded clinical research networks and community partners to establish the infrastructure that will support research at select primary care sites. Initial awards will be made this fall to fund organizations serving rural communities, but the program will expand to include other new study sites, training capabilities, and data management, as well as increased interoperability and the adoption of innovative practices and trial designs, minimizing the burden of research on primary care providers and patients. I'll link to the editorial in Science that lays out particulars of the Care for Health visions, which is to help primary care providers and their patients contribute to knowledge generation and deliver evidence back to them to achieve better care. On a related note, in a special communication recently published in JAMA, researchers discussed the need for better integration of clinical trials and healthcare delivery enterprises. This house divided is compromising medicine's ability to best serve society and needs repairing, they say. The 4 big needs identified: 1, greater clarity in ensuring appropriate regulation and oversight of implementation science, quality improvement, embedded clinical trials, and learning health systems. 2, greater adoption of study designs that improve statistical and logistical efficiency and lower the burden on participants and clinicians. 3, randomized clinical trials that are considerably more responsive and efficient by being better integrated with electronic health records. And 4, alignment of stakeholders in clinical trials and healthcare delivery enterprises through financial and non-financial incentives. While solutions exist, they have yet to be implemented at adequate scale. The authors note that in a series of upcoming articles, they will explore each of these issues in more detail and outline specific recommendations. Nevada Health Centers, a federally qualified health center, or FQHC as they're called, with 3 hub locations across the state, is now in the business of conducting clinical trials with the launch of enrollment for a cardiovascular outcome study being sponsored by Novartis, a second Alzheimer's trial sponsored by Eli Lilly that opens this fall, and a recent exploratory visit by the executive team at vaccine maker Moderna. It is believed to be only the second FQHC to successfully implement clinical trials, but unlikely the last, given the FDA's push for greater participant diversity, that these federally funded nonprofit health centers are in an ideal position to deliver. But it's a heavy lift to single-handedly implement, which is why Nevada Health Centers has chosen to partner with integrated research organization Javara to get the job done. You can read all about it in a story posted on the Clinical Research News website. I'll also provide a link in the show notes to episode 21 of this podcast if you want to learn more from the medical director of Javara about providing patients with clinical research care options. A team of researchers from Australia, India, and Thailand conducted a systematic review of 60 papers from 27 countries to better understand why pregnant and lactating women worldwide do or don't participate in clinical trials and offer frameworks for behavior change to optimize their engagement, participation, and trust. Their 24 detailed recommendations were mapped from the sentiments of would-be participants, health workers, research staff, and study investigators and ethics committees, and focus heavily on education, training, and enablement with a dash of persuasion and environmental restructuring. Interestingly, a key motivating factor to participate was the expectation of personal health benefits tied to the belief that not participating could potentially put the baby's life at risk. The hope here is to disrupt the current practice of excluding pregnant and lactating women from participation. I'll link to the paper in the show notes where you can toggle to the relevant action items for your role in the study ecosystem. Researchers at Georgia Institute of Technology have been experimenting with flicker stimulation, that is, lights and sounds delivered through goggles and headphones, as a treatment for people with epilepsy. In a recent clinical trial, flickering lights and rhythmic tones were used to modulate brain waves of 19 treatment-resistant patients who already had recording electrodes implanted in their brain for clinical reasons. The flicker treatment was found to reach deep into previously unexplored regions of the brain to reduce interictal epileptiform discharges, more easily said IEDs, the large intermittent electrophysiological events observed between seizures. The non-invasive therapy, originally developed for Alzheimer's disease, may benefit people with multiple types of neurological disorders, including multiple sclerosis and autism, which also involve these IEDs disrupting normal brain function and causing memory impairment. I'll post a link to that study in the show notes as well. And finally, a world-first study in Australia has found that precision medicine has the potential to change the model of care for children suffering from high-risk cancers, many of whom fail to respond to standard therapy. As we well know, a staggering 55% of children who received their personalized treatment achieved complete or partial remission or had their disease stabilized for at least 6 months. The study included 384 children whose cancers had a very low chance of cure and were enrolled in Australia's Zero Childhood Cancer Program, aka Zero, and involved more than 100 scientists and clinicians working together across 9 child cancer treatment centers. The children who received zero recommended treatment had 2-year progression-free survival that was more than double that of children who received standard therapy and 5 times higher than that of children who received unguided treatment. The work provides some hope to families where none previously existed and is reportedly already changing national and international clinical practice. You can read all about it in the Nature Medicine article, which I will, of course, link to in the show notes. It is now time for a chat with today's guest, McGill University's Jonathan Kimmelman, who has agreed to field some questions about research, ethics, and policies and the actual situation for clinical trial stakeholders, including, most importantly, the people and patients who are participating in these studies. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, you have sort of immersed yourself in the ethical shortcomings of clinical trials for some years now. So to get us started, do you think the overall situation has grown better or worse over the decades? And how would you defend that view?
It's hard to really say definitively whether it's gotten better or worse. What I would say is that on some dimensions, things are probably improving. For example, there's much greater transparency around clinical trial conduct. At one time, you didn't need to pre-register your trials. You didn't need to post the results of your trials. Today, it's pretty much standard and widely accepted that you do, and people are relatively compliant with that. So in some ways, things have gotten better.
Mm-hmm.
But in other ways, things have, I think, gotten worse. I think that regulators are much more permissive and less demanding of drug companies and researchers. There are many incentives in the drug development system that seem to, be growing, that are encouraging practices that are probably optimal from a perspective of trying to improve health outcomes for patients. So I think it's kind of a mix. I'd say we're sort of, some things are getting better, some things are getting worse.
Yeah, good points. We last spoke during the early days of COVID when you shared how research ethics had been knocked sideways as academic banter devolved into discourses at the extremes. Did that all go away once the pandemic began winding down? Or are we kind of still dealing with that?
We're definitely still dealing with that.
Mm.
I think COVID was a wake-up call for many of the inadequacies in the way we do research, the way we oversee and regulate research, the way we report it. I think people were shocked to learn about some of these deficiencies, and I naively expected that it would be a wake-up call for the research community to address some of these shortfalls. But I once heard a doctor say that one of the main symptoms or one of the main effects of COVID is amnesia.
Yeah, I
I
heard
think we've
that.
very quickly forgotten many of the lessons that we learned early on in the COVID pandemic. Maybe another way to put it slightly differently is this way. You know, we saw the best and the worst of what research can do during COVID. On the one hand, there was a lot of really sloppy, misleading research early on. On the other hand, within basically a year, we went from a concept to a proven effective, highly effective vaccine. And I think it was, later in the pandemic, we saw some really excellent examples of science. And I think that's what most people remember from the pandemic.
Mhm. Well, you've been more recently talking about uninformative trials where past research isn't being used to build future studies or the science itself looks shaky. What's happening here? And is this more of a new problem or an old problem?
Well, so the idea of a clinical trial is it's supposed to give you information so that you can make a decision. Should you approve this drug or should you not approve the drug? Should you run a larger clinical trial or should you not run a clinical trial? So the basic idea of informativeness is that every trial should inform some kind of a decision, whether that's a research decision or whether it's a care decision. The problem is that some of the ways that research is done result in clinical trials being uninformative. For example, if you don't publish the results, obviously decision makers can't use those results to make bedside decisions or to make research decisions.
Mm.
And what we found is that only about 30% or so of randomized trials end up informing either research or clinical decisions.
What a waste.
It's a really big problem. And I think,
Yeah.
part of the reason why there is so much uninformative research is because there are so many incentives to do research that are detached from the goal of actually informing clinical or research decision making.
Yeah. Well, since I just covered this in the news section, I also want to ask you this. That study suggesting a participation effect doesn't exist for cancer clinical trials. And as one of the investigators on that study, how surprised were you and the research field at large by this?
Yeah, we published two articles. I think you're probably referring to the paper in JAMA that was looking at participation effect.
Yeah.
But we also published another paper in Annals of Internal Medicine around the same time
Okay.
that was looking at whether patients who were randomized to new cancer treatments had better survival outcomes than patients who were randomized to the comparator arm. And essentially, both of those studies found that there really isn't any clear benefit for trial participation. So the JAMA paper in particular, what we found is that once you control for various sources of bias and confound, any survival gain that patients have on trials goes away. So for example, clinical trials tend to enroll younger patients or patients with fewer illnesses. And so if you compare outcomes on patients in trials with outcomes of patients out of trials who are taking the exact same drugs, it looks like patients survive longer in trials. But when you adjust for the age or other illnesses, that survival advantage goes away. So the net upshot of that JAMA article is that if you rigorously control for confound and biases, there doesn't seem to be any survival advantage for getting treated within a clinical trial. So the other paper, the Annals paper, is asking a related but a different question, which is if you get the treatment as opposed to the control, do you have better outcomes? And in that study, we found that for cancer randomized trials, there actually is a survival benefit for getting the new treatment. It comes out to about 5 weeks, so it's very small, but it's statistically significant. It's real. The problem is that comes at the cost of increased risk of serious adverse events, life-threatening toxicities. So you get those 5 weeks, but you give something up in terms of side effects. So at the end of the day, are patients better off going into clinical trials or staying outside of trials? It seems it's sort of pretty much even going in a trial versus staying outside a trial. Now, one sort of piece of good news from that is that patients clearly don't have worse outcomes in clinical trials. So, it's encouraging that if you go into a trial, at least there's no evidence I've produced that suggests you have worse survival on average. So that's good news. But I think if you're a patient and you're looking to join a trial because you think it's going to give you some kind of major treatment advantage, the evidence doesn't suggest that that's the case.
Yeah, these informed consent discussions need to change or be a little more nuanced than they have been, it sounds like.
I would put it a little bit stronger than that. I think nuance isn't even a picture. I mean, the consent discussions, at least the language that's used in consent forms, is somewhere between vacuous and misleading.
Oh, okay.
So, typically a consent form, if you look through consent forms for a trial, they'll say something like, you may or may not benefit from going into this trial. That, translated into mathematical language, there is absolutely no information in that statement. Essentially, it's like saying, waking up and turning on the TV and looking at a weather forecast, and the weather forecaster says, the probability of rain today is between 0 and 100%.
Yeah, super helpful. Yeah.
So, I think we can do a little bit better than that in our consent forms.
Okay.
Likewise, if you go to materials on the web that many patient advocacy groups use, that many funders like NIH use, et cetera, oftentimes they'll describe some of the reasons patients might consider trials as being the prospect of accessing a new treatment that's not yet proven, or the prospect of getting better care in a trial than outside a trial. The evidence from my studies does not suggest that's a good reason to go into trials.
Okay, lots of changes needed then, not just nuanced language. Okay, got it. But I want to turn to the role of, I'm trying to get you on everything here, the role of generative AI in clinical development, because it's a hot topic in the field, and I'm sure you're aware of that. What's your perspective on how it should and shouldn't be used as a tool in clinical trials, and what sort of patient privacy risks need to be taken into consideration on that front?
Yeah, I have only limited knowledge about these applications. So, I'm going to sort of keep my answer pretty short here on this one. So, I think that there is often a perception that we might be able to skip clinical trials or animal studies because we can rely on these, AI systems to discover new drugs and to prove they're safe and effective. And I think that really fundamentally misunderstands what is going on in drug development. At the end of the day, biological systems are incredibly complex. So too is the challenge of collecting reliable data from biological systems, right? When you study a human being, they can walk away from your experiment. So it's really, really tricky to get reliable evidence. And I guess I would consider myself a bit of a skeptic in terms of how much artificial intelligence and some of these other kinds of applications is going to obviate the need for running rigorous, well-designed animal studies as well as clinical trials before we actually approve a drug.
Yeah, it might aid and abet, but not be a replacement of any sort anytime soon.
Right.
Okay. Make sure you agree before I moved on. And I wanted to ask this also, the industry and regulators that have been pivoting to more patient-focused drug development. So I'm curious about the ethical implications when trial sponsors don't fully disclose how patient input is utilized in developing a drug. Whether it was, patients serving on advisory boards during protocol development or providing guidance on product development strategies or specific areas of clinical trial protocols, or perhaps even functioning as co-investigators. Anything to say on this front?
Maybe this is also a question I don't have a lot of sophisticated thoughts about. I haven't followed this really closely, the issue about credit or whatnot. I think I'll just say something really briefly. I mean, I think it's really, really important in drug development that there be input, conversations with patients and patient advocacy groups. I think it's critical that when we're developing drugs that are going to make a difference to patients, and only patients are going to be able to tell us what kinds of effects are going to make a difference for them. So that's really critical. I think what I sometimes wonder a little bit about is who speaks for the patients. Who it's not like patients are democratically electing representatives of their condition, and many patient advocacy groups are often receiving some funds from companies that make products for that condition, which can influence the way they shape, their description of patient needs. And so I think that one of the challenges with getting patient input is making sure that what you're getting is a representative, a good representation of what patients are prioritizing, and that's not unduly influenced, again, by patient advocacy groups that are receiving much of their budget from a vested interest.
I never thought about that side of things, but those are really good points. I want to now toggle to another topic. I know we spoke a few years back about a malaria vaccine rollout in Africa by the World Health Organization, and you made the point that ethical concerns are raised when the line between research and routine care gets blurred. I think those were your words. How does that square with a growing movement within the field to integrate clinical care and research in the name of improving patient health outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a concern for me. It's not a concern for other people. I just want to be clear that there are lots of different views on this issue. But I think that there are many ways that researchers and caregivers are looking to integrate research into care. In my view, there is no free lunch. There's sometimes a perception that if we just collect data from clinical care, we can skip some of these expensive clinical trials and use real-world evidence. In my view, at least, the ways that you would need to adjust care in order to get reliable evidence that's, again, not going to be biased and going to lead to good decisions down the road in terms of research or care, that's going to sort of end up constraining some of the ways that you deliver care. For example, standardizing exactly what information people represent on patient charts. That's something that's critical for maintaining the integrity and the validity of the data that you collect, but that may run into conflict with the way that you would normally deliver care. So, in my view, there really isn't a free lunch here. I think that if you want to maximize the quality of the information that you're getting, the best place to do it, the best way to do that is to do that in the context of a clinical trial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's one other thing that I want to sort of mention really quickly, if
please do.
You allow me,
mm-hmm.
which is that, there is also increasing effort in running what people call pragmatic clinical trials.
Yes.
So these are trials that are testing a drug as it will be used actually out there in the world, as opposed to these very special settings in which we typically run clinical trials at major academic medical centers. And pragmatic trials are really crucial if we're going to have an accurate estimate of just how valuable a drug is. There's lots of evidence showing that drugs do way better in clinical trials that lead to regulatory approval than they do out there in the real world. So pragmatic trials are a way to kind of reduce that efficacy effectiveness gap. But I think that one of the things that really concerns me is there's also growing interest and a lot of effort to try to design those studies in a way that waives informed consent, where patients don't necessarily know that they're being randomized when they're going into those trials, or even that they're participating in a clinical trial. And again, there's a lot of different views out there. many of my colleagues are defenders or proponents of waiving informed consent in the context of pragmatic trials. But from my angle, at least, it's a bit of a concern if patients are going into research and they're not aware of it. So again, I want to reflect that there's a diversity of views out there. So I don't want, when I say that I have a concern, I don't want to alarm people to, there are other people who think that these concerns can be adequately addressed. But in my view, we don't want to dispense with consent unless we have really, really good reasons to do so.
Okay, well, I certainly appreciate you stating your views. I certainly respect them. From what I've read, it sounds like you're also in favor of better policymaking, both within academia and government agencies to counter unethical behavior, intentional or otherwise. Can you give listeners a rundown? This sounds like a big question, maybe just high level. Can you give listeners a rundown of the key policies you think are necessary and would have the greatest impact? And if regulators like the FDA and Health Canada, its counterpart in your country, need to be doing something more or different?
Wow, yeah, that's a really big question. How many days do we have to answer?
Okay, one thing.
I think probably, yeah, I think that, there are a couple items that I might sort of flag as priorities. So I think the first one is maintaining really good, strong regulatory standards, not only for drug approval, but for running clinical trials. So, there's been a strong push over the last couple decades to try to liberalize drug approval, to allow drugs to be approved before they've been demonstrated to be safe and effective. And essentially what that does is it rewards companies for making products that don't make a difference in patients' lives. So if you're a believer in the free market and in capitalism, that's not a good thing. Rewarding people who are not making a product that's useful, that's how markets fail. So regulation is really one of the key ways, given the complexity of the science and that patients are in no position to evaluate the strength of evidence before they take a drug. Regulation is one of the key mechanisms that we make sure that when a company is given the green light to market their drug, it's a high quality product. It's worth paying the price for that. So I think that, drug regulation is really one of the key measures. Once you regulate drugs, you now provide strong incentives for companies to run informative clinical trials, not uninformative ones. Uninformative ones, they're just going to lose money on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, I think there's often a perception that we overregulate drugs, that we make it too hard to run clinical trials. The problem is if you make it too easy to run clinical trials, you end up with a lot of information pollution. We saw this early on in COVID, people sort of running half-baked clinical trials, lots of information getting out there, hard to kind of interpret it. Someone has to sit down, interpret it, synthesize it, figure out, separate the garbage from the good studies. That's information pollution. No one benefits from information pollution. So I think that maintaining good, high scientific standards is one of the key ways that we maintain a clean information ecosystem for medicine, and that rewards scientists professionally and financially for doing the best possible science.
I really wish I had 4 days to talk to you. You got a lot to say. I could dig in here.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, are you sure? You got anything else here you'd like to offer? Because you got the floor.
Okay, sure. I think our consent practices need to change. And I think that I've already mentioned about the fact that consent language, at least in documents, is needlessly vague or vacuous. I still can't figure out how it is that sponsors get away with writing vague language like that, and ethics committees approve that language. It's very strange to me. This happens right underneath the nose of drug regulators and ethics committees. And, to me, that's another area where I think we need to change things. I think patients should recognize that the best reason to participate in a clinical trial is to promote the enterprise of improving health for future patients. And I think if patients understood that well, they could probably make better decisions about which kinds of trials they decide to go into. They could literally vote with their feet in terms of going into the trials that have the greatest prospect of actually moving the needle for future patients and avoiding those kinds of trials that are destined to be uninformative.
Yeah, and certainly help with the recruitment problem, you would think, for the better trials as well. They're voting with their feet. There's motivation to write good protocols that patients want to be in and can understand. Uh, so much to say. I'm going to end with just one final question for you, Jonathan. Should would-be participants be worried or doing anything differently, considering everything we've talked about here today, and probably some of the things we left unsaid, even if they were doing anything to begin with, to be more self-informed?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of ways to kind of, break this question apart into, components. So the first thing I want to say is that it's really unusual for patients to be harmed in a big way from going into trials. So, when you start by asking, should patients be worried? One thing that I think patients should not worry about is being severely harmed. I think there are a lot of oversight systems that are effective at stopping trials at the first sign of potential harm, of protecting patients from needless exposure to unsafe drugs and whatnot. So that's good news. It's really rare to wake up and to read about a trial where a patient has died completely unexpectedly. The problem is not so much with patients being harmed. The problem is with patients having their time wasted. If you are a patient with cancer, you have complicated schedules. You're going to the clinic for assessments and for treatment, and you maybe wanted to use your time in a different way than you would if you were healthy. And every time you participate in a clinical trial, you're having to make extra visits to the clinic. And the concern that I would say, patients should have is making sure that the quality of the research, the science behind the study, warrants the time that you're going to give up and, the extra blood draws and the other inconveniences to participate in that clinical trial. What I would say in general is that, if you look at research quality in general, it sort of looks like if you were to walk into a typical, classroom in terms of the aptitude of the kinds of students that you would see. There's some students who maybe don't have as much scholastic promise, and some of them who are future geniuses. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with clinical research. You look at a typical clinical trial, maybe kind of middling. There's some exceptionally well-designed and justified trials. Those are super exciting. Those are the trials that are going to lead to major advances. And then there's a lot of laggard trials that probably we really shouldn't be doing. And I think the challenge is for patients to try to get into those trials that are the ones that have the greatest prospect of moving the science forward. So I think having a conversation with if you're being recruited into a clinical trial, having a conversation about the strength of support for that trial. Maybe I can give you an example that would illustrate this.
That'd be great.
Hopefully your listeners know what phase 3 trials and phase 2 trials and phase 1 trials are. Am I correct?
I believe most of them would be. Yeah, we work our way through the development process, one to three. Three, we have bigger trials, and we know a lot more about the safety of a drug by then.
Right. So, if imagine, phase 3 trials are the largest ones. So if you're a patient, it's one of the most common types of trial to participate in. Now, typically a phase 3 trial, the stereotype is that it would be supported by a positive phase 2 trial of the same drug and the same disease. So if you're running a phase 3 trial of drug X in colorectal cancer, it typically would occur after you run a phase 2 trial of the same drug in colorectal cancer patients and get a positive result. Mm-hmm. But in fact, if you look at phase 3 trials in cancer, as my team did, what you discover is about 50% of phase 3 trials in cancer, only 50% of them are supported by a positive phase 2 clinical trial. About a quarter of them, they skipped the phase 2 altogether. And another quarter of them, they ran the phase 2 trial, got a negative result, but they're running the phase 3 trial anyway.
Oh boy.
Now, I would think that patients, if you're going into a clinical trial, one thing I would want to know if you're going was there a phase 2 trial run previously? If so, was it positive? If the answer to that is no, if both of those questions, the answer is no, I would sort of wonder about whether this is really a good use of time for a patient. Mm-hmm. And in fact, just to sort of add to that, what my study did is we actually looked at the outcomes of those phase 3 trials where they bypassed phase 2 versus outcomes in phase 3 trials where they did proper evaluation in phase 2. And what we found is that there is a better risk-benefit balance if they did a phase 2 trial prior to the phase 3.
Wow. It sounds, thanks, so much good food for thought here when it comes to, how to, not waste your time, reduce harm, improve outcomes of clinical trials. I think we can agree we all sort of want that at the end of the day, even if we haven't thought about the ins and outs of how to get there. So thank you for sharing all of that. I think I speak for listeners in saying we appreciate hearing your perspectives on where our focus needs to be, and knowing you're always standing up for better oversight in areas where we are falling short. Thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast today, Jonathan, and please keep up the good work.
Thanks so much for having me.
You are so welcome. You will be invited back. As always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, please consider going to Apple Podcasts and doing so right now so you don't miss your monthly dose of news and perspectives you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. And if you're up for it, I'd also be very grateful if you'd leave a rating and review while you're there. One more thing before you go. If you like today's conversation, it is only a glimpse of what you can expect from Scope Europe presenters and panelists. Please plan to join us October 29th and 30th in Barcelona, Spain, when clinical operations executives will be sharing best practices and discussing optimizing digital and hybrid trials in Europe and across the globe. Save an additional 10% off any current rate by using the code SOT10. You heard it here. For more information, visit scopesummiteurope.com. Bye for now.